We are going to interview interesting people. We will look at current events and talk in depth about the current world transits. I'm one of your hosts, Renn Butler, and this is James Moran.
Hello.
Just got some great news. John Waller will be joining us in this exciting project. John, would you like to say hi to the group and to Rick?
Hey everybody, I'm John. Good to see you, and real pleasure to be on the call with you, Rick, and look forward to more Awakenings podcasts.
So it is our great honor to have as our first guest our longtime friend and mentor for many decades, Richard Tarnas, PhD. Rick is the founder of the school of astrology known as Archetypal astrology, as many of you know. He's been my mentor since 1980, and I had already just gotten interested in astrology at that time, but meeting you was like several quantum leaps of enthusiasm and inspiration. I've never lost the feeling of excitement about astrology since our very first conversation, for even one day since that moment, almost 45 years ago. Your book, The Passion of the Western Mind, this is a fantastic book, published in 1991. I think it took him 10 years to write, at least. It's been called The Humanities Education in one volume, and Joseph Campbell thought it was the best history of the Western worldviews ever written. That's quite an accomplishment, and Rick was still a young man when he wrote that, when he published it in 1991. In 1995, Prometheus the Awakener, it's quite a short book. James Hillman encouraged Rick to publish this. I think this is possibly the best introduction to archetypal astrology. It's a very accessible book. It's short, and it's all about the Prometheus archetype, which corresponds to the planet Uranus, as in Rick's discovery, his thesis, and people who had major Uranus natal aspects. And then came Cosmos and Psyche in 2006, as I call it, the book of the century. And Rick doesn't like inflation. One of the major themes in so many of our conversations, Rick, was how we have to guard against inflation, and that's such a pitfall in the spiritual quest, and you've been such an amazing role model in that way. 2006, when Cosmos and Psyche was published, I think that historians may look back and see that as the date of the paradigm shift. I think we're living in the re-ensouled cosmos now. It's been unveiled. It's just most people don't know it yet. And it's just hopefully humanity will catch up to these discoveries and developments. I want to thank you, Rick, for your enthusiasm, your generosity, your kindness, and your patience over so many years. I certainly had some father issues in my life, and you've been just a fantastic mentor, friend, and role model. So welcome. It's wonderful to have you.
Thank you, Renn. You're very, very generous, even as you're praising my strong suggestions about being aware of inflation. You're inflating me, so elevating me. So anyway, but I'm grateful for your understanding of the work that Stan and I have been doing over the last half century, and now you're becoming a really significant voice in the field, and then starting this program. That's great. So anyway, I'm honored to be here with you guys. And James, hi, good to see you. Glad we'll be in dialogue here too.
Me too. Thank you so much, Rick. It's great to see you, and thank you, Renn, for bringing me on this.
Yeah, you're welcome. Great. So thanks for joining us, Rick. I just wanted to, first question, was there a particular moment in your early work with Stan and your investigation of astrology when everything clicked? And when you made the correlation between the meanings associated with the 4 outer planetary archetypes, Saturn through Pluto, and Stan's 4 BPMs. I imagine one day they will make a movie about your partnership with Stan, docudrama, probably not in our lifetimes, but I wonder what that or those aha moments were like. Any specific memories where you were at the time?
Sure. Yeah, we won't hold our breath for that movie, but again, thank you for the for the Hollywood apotheosis there. So, you know, all the breakthroughs took place during the 10 years that both Stan and I were at Esalen at the same time during the 74 to 84 period. Stan stayed 3 more years while I went off to a cabin a few miles north to finish the writing, well, really do the bulk of the writing for The Passion of the Western Mind. But it was during those 10 years, and particularly in the 70s, second half of the 70s, that it was really just, it seemed like a kind of continuing stream of opening up of the horizon that included, you know, first just Stan's own intervention in psychology, the courageous work that he had done using psychedelics, LSD in particular, with such a range of subjects, psychiatric patients, and so forth, and then his ability to not only forge a powerful therapeutic practice that involved trusting the unconscious of each individual that he was working with to have its own kind of organic unfolding and healing intelligence at work, but also his insight in being able to basically begin to envision a map of the psyche, a cartography, as he calls it, that tremendously expanded our understanding beyond the psychoanalytic framework that Stan had been educated within. And you know, Joseph Campbell used to like to say in the course of some of his lectures, he'd say, you know, Freud was fishing and sitting on a whale, not realizing it, and in many ways, Jung, by opening up the collective archetypal psyche, that was a huge breakthrough that kind of recognized the whale, and then Stan, you could say, in some ways, opened up the whole ocean that whale was swimming in, and he did it in a way that combined the insights of the psychodynamic, psychoanalytic, depth psychology tradition with the insights of the great spiritual traditions and mystical teachings of both East and West, and shamanic as well. And so, I mean, an incredible achievement. And in particular, as I'm sure you've emphasized in your course here, it was his understanding of the death rebirth mystery and recognizing its intimate relationship with our own birth experience, the encounter with death, but our own birth, our reliving of birth, and the stages of birth, the perinatal matrices. An incredible breakthrough. And so just taking that in the first few months of meeting Stan, getting to work with him, hearing many lectures, I was reading his early manuscript, at that point, the big manuscript that became the basis for his first several books. And I'll just tell you one insight that was a particular aha, which happened there in the spring of '74. And that was his recognition that the experience of hell, of being in an existentially absolutely intolerably painful, excruciating condition, physical, but even more psychospiritual, existential, and that there's no way out. It will last forever. That very powerful and convincing condition that many people stumble into in deep inner work, psychedelic experience, and other and in spiritual emergencies and so forth, that very powerful experience was rooted in the powerful experience of our own birth, when there's no exit. The cervix is closed, the baby can't get out, and yet the pain is excruciating. The pressures are overwhelming. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. There's no context of understanding. All one knows is that one is a victim of overwhelming pain, and that it will never end, and there's no way out. That his insight that basically hell is a state of consciousness. It's a very powerful gestalt that is part of a larger process. That it's not measured in clock time and calendar time, but it is measured in the depth and power of the experience, and that it is processive and not the end of the road. That it's not literal, it's archetypal. That was a huge liberation. I mean, in a sense, as soon as you get that insight from Stan, if you've been in some kind of a BPM-2 related state of no exit, stasis, sense of being a victim of forces that have left you in a condition that you'll never recover from, and so forth. As soon as you get that insight, in some sense, you're liberated from it. Just the insight helps you, in a sense, move from second matrix to the third matrix. Now the pain has meaning. It's part of a birth process. It's part of a spiritual rebirth. So that was a huge. I can't help but bringing up that early aha, because as I had first entered into the understanding and the experience of psychedelics at Harvard in the 1960s, where it was very much still under the paradigm that Tim Leary, Richard Alpert, Ram Dass had established, that was Alan Watts as well. It was more of something that you could experience higher dimensions with, that you could liberate your mind from, tune in, drop out, etc. And you weren't really prepared for either how difficult the experiences could be, and secondly, how the difficult experiences could be healing, transformative, that they could be bringing up deep complexes that have been suppressed but are shaping our psyche. So in all those ways, this was a huge breakthrough, a huge gift for me personally. Even I remember my first question to Stan after a first lecture I heard him give there at the big house in the living room, where I had talked about working with people at the Haight-Ashbury Drug Clinic, and people who had bad sessions or difficult sessions, difficult journeys, trips, as we all called them at that time, bummers, in fact, as they were often called when they were a negative experience. And Stan said, in answer, I said, what do you do in that kind of situation where there's a kind of spiral descent that one can't get out of, and that is creates a kind of metaphysical panic and so forth? And he said, the full experience of that emotion is the funeral pyre of that emotion. I never heard him say that again. It was such an eloquent, poetic way of summarizing an entire therapeutic philosophy that I've always remembered that statement. It was such a spot on, deeply insightful, as well as kind of poetic summation. So that was the first sort of set of breakthroughs. Then although I've been sort of drawn gradually towards astrology. First, at Harvard, a professor at the Divinity School who was trained by Jung, a Swiss analyst named Hans Hofmann, talked to me about, we used to meet each week for just conversation about Freud and Jung and European ideas. And he brought up this out of the blue. He must have asked me my birth time and said something about, or birth date. I don't know if he asked for the time, but he just started telling me during one of these conversations where my planets were in sun and moon. And I just thought, this is nuts. This is such a sophisticated guy, and now we're talking about astrology. So that was my first encounter. And then gradually, both reading Jung, who clearly was both interested in astrology and also was using it in his practice as a therapist. And then Rudolf Steiner also had insights. I'd been reading Steiner, and his basic idea that everything that is material in the universe is a physical expression of spiritual realities. Everything that is material is expressive of a spiritual dimension of being, and that was true also of the astrology of the planets, of the cosmos, and he drew the connection with astrology. So I had started to get primed. Then you walk into Esalen, and Esalen was just like it. So many different esoteric and mystical and transformational practices and teachings were part of the ambiance there, as you know, when you came in there in 1980. And so suddenly I was in this kind of, it's kind of my graduate school after the undergraduate years in Cambridge. And it was, suddenly the horizons radically expanded in terms of what was looked at as viable and as having deep potential for human transformation, spiritual insight, and so forth. So I was moving in this direction, but it was Stan who in early 1976 said that there was a person who in his an artist who was in one of his month-long seminars, who also was an astrologer, and who had told Stan that astrology would be helpful in giving us an understanding of different kinds of experiences that people would have using psychedelics. Because if you bring in the perspective of transit astrology, the movements of the planets in the sky at any moment relative to where they were when you were born, that relationship between the transits and the natal chart is indicative of transformations or in the experience of that person, that's a way of getting a handle on understanding the ups and downs of life, and people falling in love or being being fired or going through a depressed period or joyful awakenings and so forth. So I said to Stan, like, how could that work though, in terms of, yeah, it was hard for me to wrap my mind around. He said, well, one possibility is that it's not a kind of mechanistically causal phenomenon, but rather it's something that involves that this intelligent patterning of the macrocosmic and microcosmic, above and below, as above, so below, that correlation reflected an integration that was, as Stan put it, built into the cosmos from the start, with a kind of by the cosmic mind, or the universal mind was a term he liked to use in those years, the kind of cosmic intelligence that he and many others have experienced as kind of informing everything. So that helped me get over the conceptual bump. But then it was learning how to calculate our own charts and calculate our transits, which is not that difficult. It's just, it's a series of fairly careful but not super sophisticated mathematical operations that you have to do with a couple of reference books for latitudes, longitudes, and so forth. And then you could calculate your transits. And so the first big breakthrough was basically discovering that both Stan's sessions and my sessions, which we had good records of dates and we knew the quality of experience and so forth, that those correlated with what the transit textbooks were saying about the kinds of experiences and events and so forth that people would be going through with particular transits. And these textbooks knew nothing about psychedelics. They weren't talking about powerful non-ordinary states of consciousness. They were talking about kind of, everyday experience. But when there would be a discussion or a description of a transit as being like, this is a very good period for expanding your horizons through travel, going to other countries, learning new philosophies, religious perspectives, etc. That this could be a period of expanding your consciousness in certain ways. Well, obviously there's relevance to the psychedelic experience, and same thing with more problematic, difficult experiences. So that was sort of the first set of breakthroughs, was realizing that Stan's and my transits correlated very meaningfully with our own personal sessions. And I think this is key to everybody's initiation into such a taboo or controversial form of understanding as the astrological. And that is, you have to have some kind of a personal revelation of how it's germane to your life. It has to kind of have a kind of experiential persuasiveness, and not merely theoretical and abstract, reading it in a book or something. One really has to get it. My life, my experiences, my personality, my biography all make greater sense as a result of knowing my personal birth chart and the transits through my life than before I had this tool. That's the kind of experience that I think is really transformational and kind of initiatory. So then, in terms of the breakthrough about the perinatal matrices correlating with the outer four planets, it kind of was coming in gradually. And then, as I was studying, taking in more and more astrological textbooks, getting more insight into the field, basically starting to understand that even though they weren't using the term, most astrological textbooks were really talking about archetypes, that the whole perspective was an archetypal perspective, and that bringing in that concept, both from the Platonic tradition and from the Jungian psychological tradition, greatly illuminated what astrology's basic principles were, and the understanding of the planets and sun and moon in particular, what those were trying to do, what they were based on. And so, but one day, I know I have the exact date somewhere in my transit journals, because I kept daily transit journals for about 7 years at that point, which really was a kind of foundational for my understanding. And so I'm sure I've got in one of those years transit journals the exact date that I had this kind of sudden insight that, God, everything that astrologers say about Uranus relates to BPM-4, liberating, sudden breakthrough, the unexpected quality, the sense of sudden illumination, sudden liberation from a confining situation, and so forth. And also seeing how everything related to BPM-2 was the negative Saturn. Didn't include anything positive from Saturn. As Stan said, BPM-2 doesn't really have anything positive in its phenomenology. Later, it can be seen in a positive light because it's serving the birth process. It's part of it. But, and in fact, and this, I think this is a deep spiritual insight, the very quality of the pain of hell, of the second matrix, of existential despair, is part of what it deepens the experience of spiritual joy that emerges in the fullness of time. And and so it's not that BPM-4 or spiritual rebirth simply negates and leaves behind the pain, the despair. It integrates it into a deeper, greater good, a greater joy. Christian mysticism has a phrase, "O felix culpa," o blessed fall, o blessed fault sin, that it made possible a greater spiritual joy of redemptive divine human conjunctio. Okay, so when that happened, it happened. I was up in my staff room studying when I got that insight, and then I remember talking to Stan about it soon after. We were both in the copy room of the office, the Esalen office, and just chatting while making copies for something for one of our seminars, and I mentioned, everything about the 4 perinatal matrices, everything is meaningfully connected to the 4 outer planets. And in fact, as Stan said, there's a lot of things about the third matrix. The fact that it's not only the highly sexualized quality to it, the violent and aggressive, destructive quality to it, the demonic, the scatological, the cathartic, the fiery, the pyrocatharsis, as he calls it. All these different dimensions of the third matrix are precisely, there's so many different, they're very different, and he only grouped them together because they were clustered together in people's experiences of the third matrix. And suddenly we found that here, the more you understand about the Pluto archetype in astrology, as our understanding deepened in the course of the 20th century, the Pluto Dionysus Hades complex includes Kali and Shiva and Shakti in certain facets of their quality, Pele, the volcanic god, all those qualities that are related, all those mythic expressions of this powerful Pluto archetype, they perfectly comprehend everything that's in the third matrix. And then again, also the same thing with the first matrix and its multidimensional forms of mystical unity, oceanic consciousness, aquatic consciousness, union with the mother in the womb, mystical spiritual unity, and also the negative sides of BPM-1 that can emerge. All these things perfectly connected to the positive and problematic sides of the Neptune archetype. So there we were. And you know, it takes a second if one just says that to somebody, they don't necessarily fully grasp it right away, but it, you know, he knew enough astrology at that point, and he certainly knew the phenomenology of the matrices that he took it in. And then we both started watching, you know, as we used to do at the end of breathwork sessions during the training modules, at the end of the day when people were sharing their experiences that they had during the holotropic breathwork, I would take their birth data and quickly calculate their charts and then their transits for that day's experiences, so that I could talk about how what they were going through related both to their natal chart and to their transits of the day. And Stan told me in the course of our many years together, he said that was when it totally persuaded him of the power. That's when he started thinking of archetypal astrology as the Rosetta Stone of the psyche, because it just, no other technique could illuminate these experiences as powerfully as this method. So that's a very long answer, but it gave me a chance to kind of situate your question and my answer in a, I think, a more meaningful context to understand how it emerged in the course of our years together there at Esalen.
Thank you so much, Rick. I feel submerged in that time period. That was wonderful. Along the lines of that, of kind of that unfolding discovery, when you were discovering the application of astrology with holotropic states, and then as well researching astrology, was there, in the development of archetypal astrology, was there a specific school of astrology or specific teachers of astrology, those textbooks, that informed you the most?
That's a good question. Well, certainly, as you know, in the 20th century, it kind of started in the late 19th, but particularly in the course of the 20th century, with the kind of gradual rebirth of astrology that was taking place during that century in stages, there was a great transformation of the astrological tradition, and particularly, I'd say Dane Rudhyar played the key role in bringing in the depth psychology domain of insights about the nature of the psyche, integrating that with astrology. And so that psychological astrology, as it's called, as a school, which pretty much dominates not all, but a great deal of astrological practice today, certainly in the Western world, and increasingly in other astrological traditions as well, like in India. But the overall emphasis on that it's more important to understand, to have a capacity now to for greater insight, rather than to be able to concretely predict one's future. Am I going to make $1 million? Am I going to be? Is this am I going to get this job? Whatever is the how's my romantic what are my romantic fortunes going to be for this year? Those kinds of questions become far less fruitful a way of employing astrology than using it to understand oneself and the deeper dynamics in one's life, and to place and to get a greater sense of it's a kind of psycho-spiritual orientation towards astrology. And it also puts more emphasis on our free will, on our capacity to participate in relationship to these powerful archetypal forces, complexes, and so forth. So that overall orientation dominated much of the new astrology that was kind of bursting onto the scene particularly in the 70s. It started in the later 60s. I mean, Rujar's work had been going on for a while, but got very popular in the 60s. And then Rob Hand, Liz Green, and Stephen Arroyo wrote a kind of trio of books, particularly, I'd say, Astrology, Karma, and Transformation by Stephen Arroyo. Liz Green's book, Saturn, A New Look at an Old Devil, that was her breakthrough work. And then Rob Hand's Planets in Transit. Those three books, all of which came out in short order there in the mid-70s, soon after I was entering into the astrological perspective as well. That was those were crucial for me. But I also very much was taking in the school of astrology that comes from Germany, and particularly Reinhold Ebertein's version of or school of cosmobiology, as it's called there. And if you get a book like Combinations of Stellar Influence by Reinhold Ebertein, that will give you a sense for, I mean, it's even though he never would use the word archetype, it's a very archetypal work where he just is taking the planets and their combinations and giving very short telegraphic descriptions of what the qualities, the events, the characteristics of biographical and personality, etc., even sociological, that correlate with that particular planet or combination of planets. That was a kind of Bible for many sophisticated astrologers back then in the late 60s and 70s, going into the 80s. And Renn's book, that is in some ways set up similarly, can be seen as taking that background reference and then creating a reference work that would have integrated Stan's work, and Stan's in my research, and the archetypal understanding is much more explicit there, and much more full and balanced and everything. There's Ebertein. I mean, every astrologer is going to have their blind spots, but Ebertein, going through the 2 world wars, growing up in Germany, imprisoned by Hitler for a while, etc. I mean, he's going to have a certain take on things that aren't necessarily, it's deep, but it isn't necessarily balanced at times. So I used those 2 kind of traditions, and then there is a third which more carries the mainstream Western astrological tradition that was reborn in the late 19th and 20th centuries through theosophy. And Dane Rujar comes out of that movement, but the textbook that was a series of books that were written by Sequoyan and Acker, Francis Sequoyan and Louis Acker, the book, The Astrologer's Handbook, and then their book, they had a series of booklets on transits of the sun, transits of the moon, transits of Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, etc. And all those booklets that got compressed later into a single book called Predictive Astrology. I honestly don't know if either of the Sequoian and Acker books are still in print, but they're very good reference works for getting the tradition that many astrologers continue to be influenced by, and it's very archetypally intuitive as well. So those were the three sources that I used over and over again as schools that shaped my vision. But the key thing, the most powerful influence in shaping my understanding of astrology over the decades was the combination of these three things. One, experiential psychotherapy, psychedelic experiences, direct power. When you do an LSD session or an ayahuasca or mushrooms or something like that, you're entering very deeply into the archetypal dimension, even to the point of experiencing directly gods and goddesses who are even more real than the people we know in our everyday life. Their ontological potency is so extraordinarily powerful. So doing that kind of journeying myself, but also both being at Esalen, where so many people are going through transformational experiences and wanting to get light shed on it. So and the whole community there, of course, that lived there for the better part of the years that I was there, about 100 of us. So I had all their charts and, following their transit, but it's particularly the database, as it were, of non-ordinary or extraordinary states of consciousness, however they emerge, that played a huge role in shaping my understanding of astrology. Secondly, the role of applying I had spent my life prior to this period. I'd spent my life studying history and the history of the world in more general terms, but also the history of philosophy, the history of art, the different arts, literature, painting, music, film, jazz, rock and roll, etc., classical music, and then and their biographies too. So it was applying all this to the realm of art and culture, because the arts are such a powerful expression of the archetypes. So if you have a powerful artistic experience and you look at the birth chart of the creator of that experience, like Ingmar Bergman film, or Beyonce, or whoever is the artist, and then look at their birth chart, it's so illuminating, because the artist is the vessel of the archetype, and that's why they're great artists, is that they're tapped into that depth of meaning and expression. So that was the second, art and culture. And then the third is a systematic study of history, historical event, large collective events, revolutionary periods, periods of world wars, or etc. So it was those three. I guess what I'm saying here is, in addition to the schools of astrology, what had the most impact on me after taking in, what was available in terms of the traditions and the education I could get, it was doing one's own research. That's where that has a huge role, because then you're testing things yourself and you're seeing what works. And I might just finish with this one idea. if you're timing your sessions, like I tended to do like one 500 microgram LSD session roughly every 3-4 weeks during all those years of my 20s up through age 30. And as I just realized how helpful it was to know what one's transits were, and I started taking that into account, every single journey becomes a kind of acid test, literally, an acid test of the experience. Sorry, an acid test of the paradigm, of the idea that does archetypal astrology have relevance to these kinds of experiences. So you get an immediate feedback through the powerful experience of the journey as to, okay, now I understand better how Saturn can express itself than I did before, or oh, I see what kind of an orb is operative here. It's not something I can just impose because a textbook said. I've got to have an orb that reflects the very clear message of the empirical data, namely my own experience and that of the many others who I was studying. So that's again perhaps an over expansive, elaborate answer to your question as to what were the big influences and particularly the schools of astrology that shaped my vision.
Well, thanks, Rick. It's fascinating to hear this. And I just want to say, when I first met you at Esalen, I never met a more turned on, intellectually and spiritually person. I was amazed how you could talk seamlessly about Mick Jagger and Betty Friedan and Beethoven, and basically moving from the high culture to popular culture to rock and roll, and how it was all kind of one field of study. It wasn't like in my Mormon background, we had sort of the pseudo sophisticated high arts that my parents exposed us to, and then came the counterculture, and there was a division. For you, the counterculture and the high culture were all part of one seamless field. That was a real breakthrough for me, so thank you. The question: are the principles and understandings of archetypal astrology spreading into the astrological mainstream as fast or more slowly than you imagined?
I didn't really have a well, first of all, thank you again, Ren. I'm not going to try to modify your generous compliment, but it's fantastic to hear. In a way, I don't understand myself until I get reflected from others, just like that, the recognition of the seamless field of culture, both high culture and popular culture and so forth. And growing up in the 60s, I had help with that. I mean, you have somebody like Leonard Bernstein talking, he's conductor of the New York Philharmonic, and he's talking about the Beatles and how this particular melody of this song is comparable to anything that Mozart wrote. That it was really, I mean, it's just, so there was a kind of background to being able to recognize the value and connections between higher and popular culture. The postmodern era is pretty much that change has happened. Now we all see it that way, I think. That's so you've got courses in Oxford on Bob Dylan's poetry and so forth. Now, I didn't really have a kind of sense for how quickly, or if at all, the kind of paradigm, either you could say changes or also just articulations. A lot of astrology is not reflective. It's not self-reflective. It doesn't think about what are the metaphysical or epistemological bases for this understanding. A lot of critical intelligence, critical thinking, doesn't come into the practice of astrology. Certainly over the centuries, it only gradually is entering into it more and more. But that's what philosophy is all about, is being reflective about one's assumptions. So that just articulating, as archetypal astrology and archetypal cosmology do, articulating the basic principles as well as the metaphysical and cosmological context for understanding the evidence. And so all these, and also the psychological ramifications and connecting it with the big schools of psychology. All those are, I think, it's going to be a gradual thing. So I didn't really have a time plan in my mind, or plan isn't the right word, but I didn't anticipate how it would happen. You know, Stan said something similar about his work, and I feel the same about mine. All you can do is do the very best you can in articulating what you've discovered and lay it out there so that people can pick it up if they want, and run with that baton, or that light, you know, and then carry it forward as you guys are, as everybody here in this in your course is taking in, and will elaborate and develop each in your own ways. So I think what I noticed is that after excuse me, after the film The Changing of the Gods came out, or the documentary series, and also Cosmos and Psyche, I think right around 2020, when the pandemics began, and a lot of people noticed that the things that I had said about the Saturn-Pluto cycle really related to what was happening in the world during that Saturn-Pluto conjunction, and social media being what it is, and memes and so forth. There was suddenly it was being spread a lot around the astrological world, that Cosmos and Psyche had something, had kind of anticipated this, and that it was an important work to take in. You combine that with the fact that millennials as a generation seem to be much more open to astrology than previous generations. I mean, the baby boomers were much more open than their preceding generations, but then each one since then, and millennials in particular, being born with the Uranus-Neptune conjunction as they were, pretty much exactly the span of what I understand millennials to have been born within those years. They are not as epistemologically armored as previous generations. They're more open to the fact that more is going on in heaven and earth than is dreamt of in reductionist modern thinking. And they're more, as a whole, just able to entertain potentially fruitful ways of looking at things without getting over caught up in, is this allowed by the scientific perspective that is being taught in the current biology department or something. And so that's also, I think, playing a role in it starting to spread more and more. But yeah, I couldn't say that it's going faster or slower. I think I was more surprised by how I started being invited a lot. Over the years, I've been speaking at astrology conferences and Jung institutes and associations and so forth and other audiences like Findhorn or Schumacher College and so forth, Pacifica, for many years. But suddenly in the last, say, 5 years, I'd say, and I think Zoom and the improvement of the ability to be able to give lectures that people can watch all around the world at once, or watch the recordings of, all that has helped to play a role in accelerating its acceptance. And I think that's when I noticed that there seemed to be more a sudden new kind of, I don't know, admiration or respect. And I think some of that also comes from, you know, I'm in my 70s now. You become a septuagenarian, suddenly you're an elder, and a certain regard seems to come with that. Anyway, I'm just speculating, but those are some of the factors that affect the acceptance curve.
Rick, in terms of the current astrological traditions accepting archetypal astrology, is there any philosophical or even technical differences that you feel might be an impediment, like you using wider orbs, or looking at the archetypes as having multivalence, or even just focusing on the planets themselves versus all the other elements that are in a chart?
Right. I think with each of those, it's yeah. When Darwin, you know, had his understanding of biological evolution emerge there in the 1830s and 40s, and then he finally wrote it up in his book, The Origin of Species. He says at one point in that book, I don't expect the current generation of scientists to accept these ideas, because they're so rooted in us, you know, and kind of invested in their life in certain ways of understanding animal species, that to take in this radically different perspective is more than I can see them being as likely to do. But I look to the next generation, which will be less locked into a particular dogmatic paradigm or understanding of the paradigm, and can, with more fresh eyes and flexible attitude, be able to look at the data and also seek out new data that could open up their perspective. So I think, yeah, that was it. Max Planck said that science progresses one funeral hearse at a time, and that there is a certain truth in that, even if it's a little brutally put, but there is a certain truth to that. One way of, I think part of it is how one expresses these ideas. Like if you say, well, we need to have wider orbs to understand the correlations. Well, as Rob Hand said to me at one point, he said, well, your analysis of the 60s alone shows the importance of the wider orb for understanding the outer planet conjunctions, for example. But I think if one's thinking in terms of simply widening orbs or narrow orbs, rigorous orbs, etc., that's one way of approaching the change. But if one expresses it in the sense of, it's not so much that I'm asking, finding that wider orbs are relevant, though that's true from one perspective, but from another perspective, I'm talking about the fact that these are archetypal waveforms that come in over with a kind of organic flow and webbing, ebbing and flowing, and cresting and so forth. And that once one sees these in terms of archetypal waveforms that can concrete into concrete events at any point within that larger bell curve, of intensity, frequency, significance, and so forth. Then you move out of the paradigm in terms of aspects having orbs that are like on and off light switches. And instead you see it in this more organic and in some sense more like quantum physics sort of approach, that I think that helps us get out of the mindset that's more pointillistic or atomistic, more Cartesian, and into, I think, something that's more adequate to the astrological reality, which is that these are archetypal waveforms, and they pulse into a culture, for example, coming in slowly and then building up momentum, and more is happening, and then that also helps explain why after a big world transit is over, it keeps playing a role. I mean, feminism, which had such a huge burst in the 1960s, and particularly as you get to the late 60s, radical feminism and so forth, and early 70s, but it keeps going. It doesn't just stop as soon as the Uranus-Pluto conjunction's over. It's entered into the fabric of the evolving culture, and it keeps. And then it's up to us how we sustain it, how we develop it. Same thing with the civil rights movement, with technologies and so forth. Each big new transit opens up a door into a new reality that doesn't just shut afterwards. I mean, all of us here have had certain transits that, as a result of having them, we're still experiencing the world that opened up through that transit. Could have been the transits that accompanied a new relationship coming into our life, or a new set of ideas that stays with us for the rest of our lives, or all sorts of things like that. Or it could be an illness that has lifelong, longer term effects, or an accident or something like that. So what I'm suggesting is, instead of phrasing it in terms of wider orbs, which still kind of fits into a more on and off light switch, if we more think of it as archetypal waveforms, it helps to reframe the whole issue. Same thing with now multivalence. Every good astrologer for centuries, well, I shouldn't say this, because many astrologers who are quite competent in their world were pretty fatalistic or deterministic. But certainly in the 20th century, there's more and more recognition that there are multiple ways in which particular transits or natal aspects could be expressed. And it's just as obvious as can be, is when you just take two people who were born on the same day with very similar charts, they lead lives that have certain archetypal parallels that are always synchronistically interesting to track. But at the same time, everything is shaped by as well by what culture you're born into. Are you born a male or a female, or more ambiguously, are you what kind of a family have you entered into? What's your cultural and historical epoch that that is also shaping your life, and so forth? Then there's karma. So there's so many things that will influence and inflect how a particular aspect comes through. In a patriarchal culture, it can be quite challenging for a woman to fully enact all the solar possibilities that she might have had if she weren't in such a patriarchally confining culture. And patriarchy also has the effect of marginalizing or repressing the lunar potentials of the male, except to the extent that that it comes through in weakened and pathological forms, like the the tendency to be overly dependent and having other people take care of their emotional needs and domestic needs and so forth, almost as if they're the child and needing to be cared for, even though they're the big public solar individual out in the world accomplishing great things. But they've got this undeveloped lunar side, etc. So all those contexts that are part of our human existence, they play a role in how our birth chart and our transits and our progressions and so forth will unfold. So that's another way in which observant astrologers can see that there is always there's different ways in which it can come, a given aspect or a given planetary principle can express itself. And that the multivalence, I think what archetypal astrology, I think, tries to make especially clear is that it is the multivalence of the archetypes. The fact that Saturn can be expressed as discipline, capacity to obey yourself rather than be subject to having to obey others, the positive sides of tradition, of order, of structure, of loyalty, and so forth. All these Saturnian qualities, those are expressive of the Saturn archetype just as much as depression and defeat and failure and dealing with the problems of existence. And so that multivalence that is intrinsic to every archetype, I think it's not controversial among practicing astrologers in general, but they haven't articulated it. They haven't thought through all this, and particularly their insight that multivalence is precisely what gives space for our free-willed participation, our co-creation with the archetypes of how they will be expressed. So our freedom of the will has, as it were, ontological space, room to express itself, precisely because the archetypes are not determinative of what concrete form they'll come through. That's where we come in, or the culture comes in the historical period. So again, I think multivalence is already in the understanding of many astrologers, but they haven't thought it through as much, or haven't put it in articulate terms. And that's the great value of articulation, is that can empower our ability to draw on that insight for our own psycho-spiritual growth, rather than if it's always left unarticulated, implicit, tacit, unconscious, it actually diminishes the power of the insight that we could have, even though we still are using multivalence in some way or another unconsciously in our understanding of astrology. So those are just a few thoughts about both where the resistances would come from, and also where I see the possible acceptance of these new articulations, new and old articulations and formulations.
Thank you, Rick. While we're on the trend of honoring the Promethean gifts of your work, I hope you can stand it, which as most of you probably realize, there's a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in the sky this year. So this is a very exciting year in some ways. I just want to mention that you recently stopped teaching after creating and then teaching for 30 years the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program at CIIS in San Francisco. And this involved 82 graduate courses. Rick also taught another 22 grad courses at Pacifica Graduate Institute in Santa Barbara between 1998 and 2007. Stan co-taught 16 of the CIIS courses with Rick, and they did 6 of the Pacifica courses together. And then Stan and Rick co-taught many seminars in non-academic settings over about a 40-year period. And since we've just heard that you're an elder, we're all heading toward, I just thought it would be good to honor the incredible contribution, the amazing contribution that you've made. So what creative activities and projects are you pursuing now?
Well, I just retired in June after the 30 years at CIIS, not because I didn't want to keep teaching, but 2 things. One is I wanted to make room for the new younger generation to have the faculty positions that both Brian Swim and I both retired at the same time from our program. He's the cosmologist in our program that's been, he's so influential in his own way. And so we both retired, and that and then Robert McDermott also retired. And so this sort of founding generation of the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program is kind of handing the baton on to the next generation. And then, but the other big reason that I retired is in order to write and finish the writing and the publication of the several books that I've been developing on the side over the years, kind of, gestating. When you're a teacher, as I'm sure you know, Ren, and any other teachers in the teacher, that many people have legitimate claims on your time and energy as a teacher, and so that is why it can be difficult to also publish and write books while you're a full-time teacher. So but I've kept careful notes. I've got my notebooks. I've got my most of what I want to still publish is written, but in note form, et cetera. But it takes a concentrated focus and a fair amount of time, for me at least, to then bring that into an effective, publishable form, like Passion of the Western Mind or Prometheus or Cosmos and Psyche, where I feel that there's a kind of coherent narrative. Every sentence, every word has been thought through to be as intelligible as possible, while also serving the development of the thesis or of the understanding. And so the books I'm planning on writing, one is basically a sequel to the Passion of the Western Mind, which will look especially at our current kind of global crisis in terms of our larger evolutionary and historical development, and be looking at the whole idea of the kind of moral and psycho-spiritual dimensions of this evolutionary crisis involving climate change, mass extinction of species, and many other interconnected crises that humanity is facing right now: social, political, economic, etc. So that's in a way, I'll be taking the end of Passion of the Western Mind and the epilogue and moving from that. So that's one of the books. Another will be a book on I'll publish my essays. I've got about 15 essays on archetypal astrology and cosmology that I'd like to publish as a collection instead of having them all scattered around. I want to do a book on the art and discipline of writing, which I've taught for many years in different seminars and so forth, and I'd like to. It's really a spiritual path. Writing, it's not just a profession or a hobby. So, or at least it can be a spiritual path. So, that's another one I want. And then several on archetypal astrology, on the archetypes, on the and the application of it to the arts, and also to biography. So those are some of my projects.
Right. So keeping in line with the theme of what's to come, do you have any insights to share with us about like current transits that we're going through, maybe specifically the Uranus trine Pluto that we've entered into until 2032, also the Jupiter Uranus that we're in until next summer?
Yeah, I'm going to be, I think right now we're towards the end of our time together here, and in fact, I've probably already pushed us a little bit past the limit with my expansive answers to your rich questions. But so I'll give just very concise response to, because these are such huge questions about the current transits and upcoming ones. Let me just say that in early February, I'm going to do something I've done for several years, like a kind of annual archetypal state of the world weather report that CIIS has asked me to do another one coming up this winter. So I'll be doing that in, I think it's around February 5th or so. I think it's in the first week of February, and it's I always ask that it's free, so people can watch on YouTube the ones I did for 2020, like what's happening in the stars now. I think was the title of the 2021 the 2020 lecture, and then I did one in 21 and then in 22. So this one, I took a break this year, but I'll do another one in February, and that's where I'll be able to do better justice to your question. But just briefly, yeah, the Uranus trine Pluto, you have to understand the trine comes in as a kind of it comes right after the square, and so in many ways we're still very much under the influence of the tumult that was and the powerful forces that were unleashed during the Uranus square Pluto from 2007 to 2020, even into 2021. And so now we're into the trine, but it's still got that background. Those things don't just turn off like as if somebody just turned off the electricity for it. And so, but the trine does give the potential for more, can be very helpful for, I mean, here, like a course like this is very Uranian, Promethean, and a lot of things that are sort of flowing now that were set in motion during the square, like the psychedelic renaissance, for example, the research and the therapy that's now opening up in that world. So I think we'll see a lot of that. You see it with the astrology. You see it with artificial intelligence, that Uranus, Pluto. See, Pluto just empowers, impels in an evolutionary way whatever it's touching. In this case, Uranus and the Uranian Promethean impulse towards scientific advance, towards new horizons opening up, towards experiment, towards freedom, towards change, radical change, etc. But we've also had the Saturn square Uranus for the last 3 years or so, and so, for example, AI comes in and Chat GPT, and it's both like amazing. People are taking in, like, it's just how powerful it is, and it kind of changes the drama altogether. But at the same time, there was a lot of concern, a lot of resistance, a lot of sense, like even by the people who were developing it, saying this is a genie that if it gets entirely out of the bottle, we don't really know what it will do or what it can do. And we're the ones that are developing it. So we're worried. Now that's a Saturn response to the Uranian AI phenomenon. And that's very typical too. See, Saturn always acts as a helpful counterbalance to one-sided development and less mature or grounded or responsible forms of any given archetype, whether it's Venus or Uranus or anything else. So we always have to take any given transit, like the Uranus trine Pluto, in relationship to the other world transits that are ongoing, because they all influence the final result. The Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, which overall basically went from this last summer starting up through next summer. But the way this particular one has unfolded is that it's been staying in the somewhat outer regions of the waveform of the orb, but it's getting really tight as we come into the new year, into the spring in particular. And then it starts moving out of orb there in the summer. And the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction periods are just quite amazing. If you've got new projects that you've been wanting to start, this is the time to do it. It's a very good period overall for expanding your understandings, for new beginnings, for new relationships. I don't just mean romantic. They could be of a new teacher, a new set of ideas that liberates you and suddenly opens up that horizon in ways that endure. So the big danger with Jupiter-Uranus, well, one is inflation, of course. Jupiter likes to feel big and superior, and Uranus together with it, it kind of really empowers that. Think of Napoleon's kind of hubris as he exaggerates what he thinks he can pull off militarily. And I mean, he's born with the Jupiter-Uranus opposition, and the fall that can come from that inflation, that hubris. So there's that, and also less catastrophically, but something you want to keep in mind with Jupiter-Uranus. Yes, it's a really good period for investigating new directions and experiments and starting new projects or of all kinds. I mean, if you want to read 80 pages or so of just so many cultural breakthroughs and historical breakthroughs, artistic, political, etc. I have about 70, 80 pages in Cosmos and Psyche just devoted to the Jupiter-Uranus cycle. It's quite amazing how consistent it is, and in every field of human endeavor that I am adequately familiar with to have examined. So it's a great period for such breakthroughs and milestones. They won't necessarily be known as such at the time they're happening. I have a whole chapter on hidden births of things. Nobody knew that Stephen Jobs and Steve Wozniak were in the garage during the Jupiter-Uranus alignment of the mid-70s. Start building the personal computer that would become Apple. So that's nobody knew that Beethoven was writing the Eroica Symphony during the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction of 1803. That comes with time. So those are like hidden births. But the big thing that I want you to be conscious of with Jupiter-Uranus is virtues of hard work, of foundations, of building foundations, of finding roots, of discipline, of bringing in order and structure, so that your breakthrough doesn't become a flash in the pan, but it becomes something that endures. So those are some thoughts about the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction that we're going to see get stronger and stronger over the next 8 months or so.
Thank you, Rick. And don't worry about the time. This is very precious. I'm certainly feeling the Jupiter-Uranus sense from this meeting and from this Grof Studies course. And I was in Denver with many of you in June, and that feeling in the air there was just amazing, wasn't it? James Moran and so many of you, the sense of open possibilities. As Rick writes, the Promethean impulse or the breakthrough impulse can be granted success during these times. So I think doing our own sessions, keeping up with our own inner work is one way to make sure that it is breaking through on a deep level and not just some flash in the pan, as Rick has mentioned. So we're almost to the end of our questions. Rick, do you have any encouraging perspectives for humanity about the Saturn conjunct Neptune world transit we are moving into this spring for 3 years?
Yeah. Again, there's a lot that could be said for that, and of course, and as I mentioned, I will address these things in greater detail when I've got more time in that CIIS public program that will be a webinar that will be free in early February on the kind of state of the world transits for 2024. Saturn Neptune is a challenging combination because, you know, Neptune is our spiritual aspirations, our ideals, our dreams, and Saturn is this hard reality at its and so it can correlate with, you know, psychological challenges. People tend to do more inner work, more therapy during this period. It's a period at its best where where there's an impulse to bring the ideals into concrete manifestation and to do the hard work that is necessary to ground those ideals. So that's why you see people like Martin Luther King or Thich Nhat Hanh or the Dalai Lama with their Saturn Neptunes, and how they all are seeking to bring these high spiritual aspirations into the practical social economic relations of this world. But it can bring a dark night of the soul. There's no question about it. It can happen collectively, where there's a sense of malaise, of discouragement, of how long it's taking to realize one's ideals and so forth. So there has to be it takes a certain courage to work with the Saturn Neptune, and one thing that I find very helpful to remember is that faith which has a lot to do with Neptune and our kind of spiritual ideals, has a lot to do with faith grows in darkness. It's like the seed that requires the being in the darkness of the soil in order to blossom. And we don't develop our capacity for a faith in a higher reality emerging in our world. We don't develop that capacity when everything is just grand and we've got majestic music playing and everything is just perfect and there's no problems at all that one is dealing with, and you're just in a kind of happy state of ecstatic unity with the joy of life, faith isn't developing then. It's a muscle. It's like faith and hope, compassion. These, in a sense, require the Saturnian world to develop in the same way that muscles need something, need resistance to be able to forge themselves. The strength doesn't come from everything being easygoing. You lift the weights. You push the barriers with great effort, and then that's what develops the moral and spiritual strength. So that's something to keep in mind. And often with Saturn, Neptune, it can be a very good period for things that involve a spiritual discipline or practice, often one with a tradition. So things like meditation or prayer, or things that have a kind of ritual structure to them, but with a higher aspiration that informs them. All those are yoga, concentrated focus on the psyche, psychotherapy, doing deep therapy. I mean, Freud had a Saturn Neptune alignment in his chart, major aspect, right on his moon. So it was quite a powerful one. And he kind of initiates the whole recognition that in our symptoms, in our pathologies, in our suffering, is meaning. And we have to do the hard work of delving into our unconscious in order to bring that meaning to the surface. His understanding of the meanings was kind of limited by his kind of 19th century materialist reductionism, but Jung and Stan and Marie-Louise von Franz and many others have deeply expanded our understanding of what that journey is about. So those are a few suggestions about the Saturn-Neptune alignment coming up, the conjunction.
Rick, lastly, we've talked about how to apply archetypal astrology to the growth of the individual in terms of looking at their transits, understanding the birth chart, looking at their transits in conjunction with holotropic states. Is there a way you feel that archetypal astrology can help kind of heal the collective of humanity?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have thought a lot about it. I wrote an essay. I wonder if I put it on the cosmosandpsyche.com website. It's an essay called The Role of Astrology for a Civilization in Crisis, or the role of astrology in a civilization in crisis, where I addressed that at greater length. It was originally a lecture I gave, the Charles Carter Memorial Lecture in England for the British Astrological Association. And I'll just say one quick couple of headlines about what in answer to your question, and that is, one, having the archetypal astrological perspective is a way of both staying true to the intellectual and spiritual development that has forged us, that it comes, we're not just cutting it off, but it helps heal the kind of Cartesian bubble that was established for the modern self, where it feels as what Alan Watts called it, the skin encapsulated ego, or so many modern philosophers and scientists talk about, how we are solitary forms of consciousness in a vast, unconscious, meaningless, purposeless universe, and that we're fundamentally different from everything else in that respect, and that it creates a sense of isolation, of alienation, etc. And there's something very healing about discovering that, in fact, intelligence and purpose and meaning pervade the cosmos, and we are participating in that. We're not the isolated subject in an world of objects. We're subjects in a communion of subjects, as a large community, a cosmic community of subjects, as Thomas Berry or Teilhard might put it. And so there's something very healing about the very act of astrological perception. Every time you calculate and interpret a birth chart or your transits, it's a revolutionary act that can be quite healing, because you're overcoming that, both the boundary between like mind and world, subject and object, human and non-human, above and below, etc. You also are breaking out of the vision of the universe as being meaningless and purposeless. Suddenly you realize that you're embedded in a world of profound purposes and meanings that are and cycles of unfolding that are taking place that we're participating in, and that in fact we have a role to play because we are conscious, because we do have agency. And so in all these respects, we are, I think, astrology, and particularly archetypal astrology, could play a role, especially when combined with deep inner work, and whether it's psychedelic or meditation or holotropic breath work or Grof breath work, etc. All those, if you combine that with the astrological perspective, which opens up the cosmos into this new domain of meaning, you have a much it's a healing, when it's a threshold that when you cross that has great healing consequences. And in that sense, our civilization needs healing, because no civilization has ever existed decade after decade, century after century, convinced that only human beings have the potential for spiritual, moral consciousness, purposes, and meanings, and that the entire rest of the universe lacks these. No civilization, no society in human history has ever attempted to sustain a civilization on that basis. And the crisis that we're in, like the climate crisis and the relationship of humanity to the rest of the Earth community, is to some extent to a great extent, a consequence of that bifurcation between meaning-seeking human beings and a meaningless universe, which is not an actual. It's not an actual polarity. It's a polarity that has been shaped by a particular interpretation that has become pervasive in the modern world, and that's in that way, astrology could play a key role in helping us. It can be an initiatory experience. It can help initiate us to a much deeper and more healing worldview. So, well, I think we probably have completely exhausted the energies and attention spans of everybody here, and hopefully we've covered much of what we intended to during our conversation here.
It was wonderful, Rick. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
It was really illuminative, and I always inspired listening to you, and I feel like getting even more into astrology. So I just wish there were more hours in the day. Thank you, Rick.
Thank you, Renn. You're doing great work, as are you, James. And I'm grateful for this, the privilege of being able to speak to all of you today. It's all of you out there. I see your chat comments coming in, and the expression of thanks. I really appreciate them. It means a lot to me.
Yeah, and you've influenced not only us, but I think Chad might be on the call, Art, Alexis, probably many others. So thank you. I want to thank James for co-hosting this episode. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. I'll say goodbye to everyone. I think people have enough of me here, and I'll let you carry on, Ren and James. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.